In its first year, Deadwood averaged one murder a day. No sheriff, no courthouse, no jail. When a drunk shot Wild Bill Hickok in the back of the head at a poker table, a miner's court acquitted him the next day. That verdict did not count. Not because it was wrong, but because the town sat on land the United States had promised, by treaty, to the Lakota Sioux. No one in Deadwood had authority over anything, including Deadwood. The Black Hills rise from the western South Dakota plains like something the earth forgot to flatten. From a distance, the thick stands of ponderosa pine that cover them look almost black against the pale grass, which is how the Lakota came to call them Pahasapa, the Black Mountains. For generations before any white surveyor set foot in the region, the Lakota held the hills as sacred ground. Not sacred in the way that word gets used loosely now, to mean special or beloved, but sacred in the way that a people will structure an entire civilization around a place and refuse to sell it for any price, even when the price climbs past $1 billion. That refusal would come later. In 1868, the hills were simply home. The Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed on the 29th of April that year, at a military outpost in what is now eastern Wyoming. On one side sat generals and commissioners of the United States government. On the other sat leaders of the Oglala, Minneconjou, and Brule bands of the Lakota, along with Yanktonai Dakota and Northern Arapaho. The treaty was not a gift. It was the price of ending Red Cloud's War, a 2-year campaign of raids and ambushes along the Bozeman Trail that had cost the Army men forts, and credibility. Red Cloud himself refused to sign until the soldiers abandoned the trail and burned the forts they had built along it. He watched the smoke rise before he came to the table. Article 2 of the treaty set aside the Great Sioux Reservation, a territory that included the entire western half of present-day South Dakota, and within it, the Black Hills, designated for the, and here the treaty's own language is worth hearing, absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Indians. No unauthorized person would ever be permitted to pass over, settle upon, or reside in the territory. Article 12 required that any future change to the treaty must be approved by 3/4 of all adult male Sioux. The language was unambiguous. The United States Senate ratified it in February of 1869. The treaty held for 5 years. In the summer of 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer rode out of Fort Abraham Lincoln near Bismarck with 1,200 men, a 16-piece brass band, and 2 civilian miners. The stated mission was reconnaissance, finding a suitable location for a military fort in the Black Hills. The actual mission was gold. On July 30th, the 2 miners found placer deposits in French Creek, near what is now the town of Custer, South Dakota. Custer sent a dispatch to Fort Laramie that would reach newspapers across the country within weeks. He reported gold among the roots of the grass. That phrase did more damage than any bullet Custer ever fired. Within months, miners began pressing into the hills by the hundreds, then the thousands. The Army made a show of turning them back. Patrols intercepted wagon trains on the plains and escorted prospectors out of the territory. But the effort was half-hearted at best, and the government knew it. President Ulysses Grant privately told his military commanders to stop interfering. He offered the Lakota $6 million for the Black Hills. They refused. Grant then issued an order requiring all Lakota bands to report to reservation agencies by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile. Bands that had been hunting on their own treaty-guaranteed land, some of whom did not even receive the order before the deadline, were now enemies of the United States. The machinery of dispossession was running. What it needed was a destination. In the fall of 1875, a group of prospectors working the northern hills found what the French Creek deposits had only hinted at. Thick, promising gold in a narrow canyon choked with the gray skeletons of dead pine trees. The canyon would take its name from those trees. By the spring of 1876, word had traveled to Cheyenne, to Omaha, to Chicago, and to the docks of San Francisco. Men sold farms, quit jobs, abandoned families. They came by oxen train, by horseback, on foot, carrying shovels and gold pans and flour sacks and pistols, and they poured into the gulch with no regard for who owned it. On the 25th of April, 1876, at the junction of Whitewood and Deadwood Creeks, nearly 5,000 feet above sea level, the town of Deadwood was laid out. The first structures were canvas tents staked into mud. Within weeks, 3 sawmills were cutting ponderosa pine from the surrounding slopes, and the tents gave way to cabins and false front buildings thrown up with green, sap-filled lumber. The town filled the narrow floor of the gulch and climbed the hillsides in uneven terraces, wedged between creek and cliff with no room to spread and no plan for drainage. The sound of hammers mixed with the sound of pickaxes, mixed with the sound of mules. Deadwood smelled of pine pitch, horse manure, coal smoke, and creek water that was already turning brown with mine tailings before the town was 2 months old. No territorial legislature had authorized a settlement. No federal agency had approved one. The Dakota had not ceded the land. The treaty requiring 3/4 approval from adult male Sioux had not been amended. Deadwood existed because several thousand armed men had decided it would exist, on ground the United States government had sworn, 8 years earlier, they would never touch. Every building in town, every claim stake driven into the creek bed, every transaction conducted on Main Street was, in the strictest legal sense, an act of trespass. The town had no charter, no courts, no officers of the law, and no mechanism to create any of these things, because the jurisdiction required to establish them did not exist. Deadwood was not merely lawless in the sense that it lacked order. It was lawless in the sense that law itself had no purchase there. The distinction matters because everything that happened next, the killings, the trials, the fortunes made and lost, the fires, the rebuilding, all of it unfolded on a foundation that was never at any point legal. The dead trees that gave the gulch its name had been killed by a flood years before the first miner arrived. They stood bone white and stripped of bark along the canyon walls, a forest of remains. The men who named the place after those trees did not see any symbolism in it. They were looking at the creek. What Deadwood looked like in the summer of 1876 was this: a crooked seam of mud and timber wedged into a canyon so narrow that 2 wagons could barely pass on Main Street without one of them putting a wheel in the creek. Whitewood and Deadwood Creeks met at the north end of town and ran south through the middle of everything, carrying mine tailings and sewage in equal measure. The buildings climbed the hillsides in ragged tiers, tents and shanties, clinging to slopes so steep that a man stepping out his back door might find himself looking down at his neighbor's chimney. The gulch floor was 5,000 feet above sea level, and the air smelled of fresh-cut ponderosa, wood smoke, horse dung, and something metallic rising off the creek that no one talked about and everyone breathed. By the end of that first year, 200 buildings stood along Main Street, and the side alleys branching off it, housing 173 businesses. 56 of those businesses were gambling halls. 33 were what the local press delicately called sporting houses. The first floor of a typical Main Street building held a saloon or a dry goods store. The second floor held women. This arrangement was not hidden. It was the economy. The men who filled Deadwood in those first months were not, for the most part, the kind of men who planned ahead. They were placer miners, which meant they worked the gravel beds of the creeks with pans and sluice boxes, following rules borrowed from Montana gulch camps. Each claim measured 300 feet along the waterway, stretching from rimrock to rimrock. An experienced miner earned $4 to $7 a day, paid not in currency but in gold dust, weighed on a scale at $20 per ounce. The dust itself was money. A man bought his whiskey with a pinch of it, bought his beans the same way, and lost what remained at a faro table before the week was out. By July of 1876, $1 million worth of gold had already come out of the Black Hills at that rate. The math sounds grand until you divide it among the thousands of men pulling it from the ground. Most of them were breaking even. Some were not even doing that. The women arrived on schedule. On July 12th, Colorado Charlie Utter and his brother Steve drove a wagon train into the gulch, carrying over 100 passengers from Cheyenne, Wyoming. Among them were two experienced madams known as Dirty M and Madam Mustache, along with a contingent of working women who had plied their trade in mining camps from California to Nevada. The miners lined Main Street and cheered as the wagons passed. That is not legend. Multiple accounts confirm it. In a town where the male-to-female ratio was so extreme that 90% of the women in Deadwood were prostitutes, the arrival of the wagon train was treated less as scandal than as civic improvement. Also on that wagon train, riding as an outrider alongside Charlie Utter, was a 39-year-old gambler and former lawman named James Butler Hickok. He arrived in Deadwood with a reputation for gunfighting that had been inflated by dime novels and newspaper correspondence until the real man could barely be separated from the character. His eyesight was failing. He had no claim to stake and no job waiting. He came to Deadwood for the same reason most people came to Deadwood, because he had run out of better options. 2 days after Hickok's arrival, Seth Bullock and his business partner Solomon Starr pulled into town with a wagon load of hardware. Bullock was a Canadian-born former sheriff from Montana Territory who intended to sell mining equipment, lumber, and nails. He opened Starr and Bullock Hardware on Main Street on August 4th, stocking shovels and picks and lengths of rope. Bullock would become the town's first sheriff within a year, but that summer he was a merchant, and a merchant in Deadwood sold to anyone who could pay in dust. The absence of law was not a metaphor. Deadwood had no police force, no municipal court, no mayor, and no charter until October of 1876, when a local businessman named E.B. Farnham was elected to a post that carried a salary of $100 a year and the authority to do almost nothing. Before that, the only semblance of order came from miners' courts. Ad hoc assemblies of armed men who gathered when a dispute grew too loud to ignore, appointed a judge from among themselves, heard arguments, and rendered verdicts that had no legal standing whatsoever. These courts could banish a man, fine him, or hang him, and no territorial authority had any say in the matter, because territorial authority did not extend to Indian land. That legal vacuum shaped everything. Dance halls, gambling dens, saloons, and brothels operated along both sides of Lower Main Street in a district that residents themselves called the Badlands, and the name was not ironic. Opium dens operated in the Chinese Quarter at the northeast end of Main Street, where a community of Chinese immigrants, many of them former railroad workers, had established laundries, restaurants, and shops. A merchant named Wong Fee Lee arrived in 1876 and became a community leader who would serve the Chinese population until his death in 1921. The Chinese Quarter was tolerated in part because the Dakota Territory placed no restrictions on foreign property ownership, and in part because Deadwood, having no legal foundation of its own, was in no position to restrict anyone. By one account, the town averaged a murder a day in that first year. That number is worth pausing over. A settlement of 5,000 to 10,000 people, depending on who was counting and when, producing a killing every 24 hours, means that violent death was not an aberration in Deadwood. It was weather. It happened with the regularity and the impersonality of weather, and people adjusted to it the way they adjusted to the mud and the cold and the smell of the creek. They stepped around bodies the way they stepped around horse droppings. On August 12th, 3 weeks after the wagon train arrived, smallpox broke out. So many people fell sick that tents had to be erected outside town to quarantine the stricken, and the dead were carried up the hill to a plot that would eventually become Mount Moriah Cemetery. The epidemic did not empty the town. Nothing emptied the town. Men kept coming, drawn by the same arithmetic of hope that fills every gold camp, the long odds made bearable by the one man in 100 who hits a pocket of color and walks out rich. On June 8th, the Black Hills Pioneer had published its first edition, making Deadwood a town with a newspaper, before it was a town with a government. The paper recorded claim disputes, reported on the price of flour and ammunition, and printed notices of the dead with a matter-of-factness that suggests the editors had stopped being surprised. On the 4th of July, 1876, Deadwood residents celebrated the centennial of the United States, an act of patriotic enthusiasm that required ignoring the fact that the Dakota Territory would not achieve statehood for another 13 years, and that the town itself existed in open violation of the laws of the nation whose birthday they were toasting. That is the kind of detail that Deadwood generates without trying. A town that could not legally exist, celebrating the birth of the country whose treaty it was breaking, on land guaranteed to a people who were at that very moment fighting the army that had guaranteed it. 10 days before Deadwood's 4th of July party, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors had destroyed Custer's 7th Cavalry at the Little Bighorn, 250 miles to the northwest. Word of the battle would not reach Deadwood for weeks. When it did, it changed nothing about the price of gold or the hours at the gem. James Butler Hickok had been in Deadwood for 3 weeks when he died. In that time, he had done almost nothing of consequence. He played poker. He drank. He wrote letters to his wife, Agnes, whom he had married 5 months earlier in Cheyenne and would never see again. The letters were tender and domestic, full of plans for the future and complaints about his declining luck at the card table. He told her he hoped to make enough money to send for her. He told her he missed her. The man who wrote those letters bore little resemblance to the figure the newspapers had built, the cold-eyed pistolier of Abilene and Springfield, the hero of a dozen gunfights that may or may not have happened the way the magazines described them. By the summer of 1876, Hickok was 39 years old, his eyesight was deteriorating, and he had not been in a gunfight in 5 years. He came to Deadwood as a gambler, not a lawman, and he was not a particularly good gambler. On the afternoon of August 1st, Hickok was playing 5-card draw at Nuttall and Mann's Saloon No. 10 on Main Street. A drunk named Jack McCall sat down at the table when a seat opened. McCall was a drifter from Kentucky, a former buffalo hunter with a crooked nose and crossed eyes, and he lost badly. Hand after hand, McCall watched his money slide across the table. When he was cleaned out, Hickok did something that was either generous or insulting, depending on who was receiving it. He gave McCall money and told him to go buy himself breakfast. He advised McCall not to play again until he could cover his losses. McCall took the money and left the saloon. What happened next was shaped by a chair. On the afternoon of August 2nd, Hickok returned to Nuttall and Mann's for another game. He habitually sat with his back to a wall so he could see anyone entering the room. When he arrived, the only open seat faced away from the door. A man named Charles Rich was sitting in Hickok's preferred spot and refused to trade. Hickok asked twice. Rich declined twice. Hickok sat down with his back to the entrance and picked up his cards. At approximately 4:15 in the afternoon, Jack McCall walked into the saloon. He moved along the bar, ordered a drink, then stepped behind Hickok's chair. He drew a .45 caliber Colt revolver, shouted something. Witnesses recalled the words differently, though most agreed on some version of "take that," and fired a single shot into the back of Hickok's head at a distance measured in inches. The bullet passed through Hickok's skull and exited his right cheek, lodging in the wrist of another player at the table. Hickok slumped forward, then slid from his chair onto the floor. He was dead before he hit the planks. The cards in his hand, according to accounts that solidified over the following decades, were 2 black aces and 2 black eights. The 5th card has never been identified with certainty. The combination became known as the dead man's hand, and it has held that name for 150 years. McCall tried to fire at other men in the saloon. Every remaining cartridge in his revolver was a dud. He ran out the door and attempted to mount a horse tethered outside, but the saddle had been loosened, and he fell to the ground. He scrambled up and ran down Main Street until a crowd caught him and dragged him into a butcher shop. The whole sequence, murder, failed escape, capture, took less than 10 minutes. The next morning, the town assembled a trial. It convened in McDaniel's Theater, a wooden building that served as Deadwood's closest approximation of a public hall. The proceedings had all the visible features of a court: a judge, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, witnesses, a jury of minors, and none of the legal authority. McCall claimed that Hickok had killed his brother back in Kansas. The claim was almost certainly a lie. No evidence of a brother named McCall being killed by Hickok has ever been found, but the jury, after deliberating for 2 hours, acquitted him. The acquittal was not as strange as it appears from a distance. Some historians have speculated that McCall was encouraged or paid to kill Hickok by gamblers who feared Hickok might be appointed town marshal and clean up their operations. Others point out that miners' courts were erratic by nature, swayed by whoever argued loudest or bought the most drinks. But the deeper strangeness was structural. The court had no jurisdiction. The judge had no commission. The verdict had no force. Deadwood sat on Lakota treaty land, where no territorial government operated and no civil authority had standing. A murder had been committed. A trial had been held, and a man had been set free, and the entire proceeding had the legal weight of a stage play performed in the same kind of building where stage plays were usually performed. McCall understood none of this. He left Deadwood believing he was a free man and headed into Wyoming Territory, where he made the mistake of bragging about killing Wild Bill Hickok in every saloon that would listen. A United States deputy marshal in Laramie heard the boasting and arrested him on August 29th. Federal authorities in the Dakota Territory ruled that the Deadwood trial was invalid because the court had no legal standing. Double jeopardy did not apply, they argued, because jeopardy had never attached. You cannot be placed in legal peril by a body that possesses no legal power to place you there. McCall was taken to Yankton, the capital of the Dakota Territory, and tried again. The second trial began on December 4, 1876. No witnesses testified for the defense. The jury returned a guilty verdict on December 6th at 10:15 in the evening. McCall was hanged on March 1st, 1877, the first legal execution in the history of the Dakota Territory. When his body was exhumed years later, during the relocation of the cemetery, the noose was still around his neck. Colorado Charlie Utter, who had driven the wagon train that brought both Hickok and McCall to Deadwood, paid for the burial. He placed a wooden board at the head of the grave and carved into it an epitaph that managed to be both sentimental and precise. Wild Bill, J.B. Hickok, killed by the assassin Jack McCall in Deadwood, Black Hills, August 2, 1876. Pard, we will meet again in the happy hunting ground to part no more. Goodbye, Colorado Charlie, C.H. Utter. The phrase happy hunting ground would sound condescending today. In 1876, on stolen Lakota land, it carried a irony that Utter almost certainly did not intend. Hickok's body was later moved to Mount Moriah Cemetery on the hill above town. Calamity Jane, who had arrived on the same wagon train and who spent the rest of her life claiming to have been Hickok's lover. A claim his letters to his wife do not support, asked to be buried next to him when she died in 1903. Her request was granted. In death, as in life, Deadwood arranged its legends without much concern for whether the people involved would have consented. The killing changed nothing about the town's daily operations. The saloons stayed open. The poker games continued. The claims along the creek produced their few dollars a day. What Hickok's murder did accomplish, quietly and almost by accident, was to demonstrate the central paradox of Deadwood's existence. A man could be killed in broad daylight, tried by a jury of his neighbors, and acquitted, and then tried again by a different court, convicted and hanged, because the first court was fiction. Not corrupt, not biased, fiction. The town that built it had no more authority to hold a trial than it had to exist in the first place. Everything in Deadwood, every handshake, every transaction, every verdict, rested on a consensus among armed strangers that things were real because they said they were. When a higher authority arrived and disagreed, the consensus dissolved, and Jack McCall hanged. 3 days before Deadwood was laid out as a town, and 4 months before Wild Bill Hickok sat down to his last poker game, 2 French-Canadian brothers named Moses and Fred Manuel were working a fork of Gold Run Gulch about 4 miles to the southwest. They had partnered with a prospector named Hank Harney and a man named Alex Eng, and together the 4 of them had been following float quartz, loose fragments of gold-bearing rock carried downhill by water back to its source. On April 9, 1876, they found it, a massive outcropping of ore in a hillside near what would become the town of Lead. They staked their claim and gave it a name that carried a modest hope. They called it the Home Stake, because they believed it might be rich enough to send them home in style. They extracted $5,000 worth of gold that spring, using hand tools and a crude stamp mill they built themselves. It was good money, better than panning the creeks, and it confirmed what the 4 men suspected, that the placer gold washing down through the gulches of the northern Black Hills was coming from somewhere, and that somewhere was rock. The distinction between placer mining and hard rock mining is the distinction between picking up loose change and breaking into the vault. Placer miners work surface gravel with pans and sluice boxes. Hard rock miners follow ore underground, and underground mining requires capital. Timber, dynamite, ventilation, heavy equipment, labor, that 4 men with a hand-built mill could not provide. Word of the Homestake outcropping traveled fast. Samples of the ore reached San Francisco, where a 57-year-old mining speculator named George Hurst examined them and recognized what the Manuel brothers did not fully understand, that the surface veins they had found were likely the top of something much larger. Hurst had been broke when he first struck gold in California in 1857. By 1877, he was one of the wealthiest miners in the American West, with stakes in the Comstock Lode in Nevada and the Ontario Mine in Utah. He was loud, shrewd, ambitious, and functionally illiterate. He could barely write a sentence, but he could read rock the way other men read contracts. He arrived in Deadwood in October 1877, looked at the homestake, and bought it. The purchase price was $70,000, split among Hurst and his 2 partners, Lloyd Tevis and James Ben Ali Hagen, both San Francisco financiers. The Manuel brothers, Harney and Eng, took the money and walked away. They had their homestake. They went home. What they left behind would produce 40 million ounces of gold over the next 125 years. Hurst understood from the start that the homestake claim alone was not enough. Several gold veins ran near the surface, but he suspected they converged underground into a single massive body of ore, a vein that might run 500 feet wide and grow wider as it went deeper. To control it, he needed to control every claim touching his. He set about acquiring them with methods that ranged from fair to criminal. He bought some claims outright, paying prices that made the sellers feel lucky. He secured others through the territorial courts, filing suits that smaller operators could not afford to contest. When a man refused to sell, a Hearst employee killed him and was subsequently acquitted after every witness to the killing disappeared. Hearst purchased newspapers in Deadwood to shape public opinion in his favor. An editor at a competing paper was physically beaten on a Main Street sidewalk. Hearst himself was not naive about the risks of this approach. He wrote a letter to his partners in San Francisco asking them to provide for his family should he be murdered in the Black Hills. He was not murdered. Within 3 years, he had added the Golden Star, the Crown Point, the General Ellison, the May Booth, the Old Abe, and several other claims to the original homestake, consolidating over 30 acres of mining property and 600 acres of surrounding land. By the time he left in March of 1879, the homestake was not a claim anymore. It was an industry. The machinery followed. Hearst arranged to haul mining equipment by wagon from the nearest railhead in Sidney, Nebraska, a distance of more than 200 miles across open prairie with no paved road. An 80-stamp mill was built and began crushing homestake ore by July 1878, each stamp dropping with a rhythmic thud that could be heard for miles, pounding rock to powder so the gold could be separated by mercury amalgamation. The number of stamps would eventually approach 1,000. Employment at the mine would exceed 2,000 men. The town of Lead, which grew around the mine's headworks, would become the second most populous settlement in the territory. On January 25, 1879, Hearst and his partners took the Homestake Mining Company public on the New York Stock Exchange. It was the first mining stock ever listed on the exchange. Shares in a hole in the ground on stolen Dakota land, 4 miles from a town that had no legal charter, were now being traded on Wall Street by men who would never set foot in South Dakota. The effect on Deadwood was immediate and structural. The age of the individual prospector was ending. Placer mining along the creeks had always been a gamble. A man with a pan, working gravel, hoping to find enough color to justify another day. Hard rock mining was not a gamble. It was a business, and it required workers, not prospectors. The men who had come to Deadwood to strike it rich now had 2 choices: go to work for wages in someone else's mine or leave. Many left. Those who stayed traded independence for $4 to $7 a day and a set of rules written by a corporation headquartered in San Francisco. Deadwood itself shifted from a supply camp for independent miners to a support town for an industrial operation centered in Lead. The saloons and gambling halls and brothels remained, because men who work underground in 12-hour shifts still want whiskey and cards and company when they surface. But the economic center of gravity moved 4 miles southwest, to the headworks and the stamp mills, and the wealth that came out of the ground no longer stayed in the gulch. It traveled by wagon, and later by rail to Lead, to Omaha, to San Francisco, to New York. The gold that had drawn 10,000 people to a canyon full of dead trees was now feeding balance sheets that most of those people would never read. George Hearst died in 1891 with an estimated fortune of $200 to $400 million. His widow Phoebe took control of the homestake operations and ran them for 28 years, building a library, a hospital, a recreation center, and a kindergarten for the miners' families in Lead. She also opened the Hearst Mercantile Company, the largest department store in South Dakota, which extended unlimited credit to homestake employees. Payments were deducted from their paychecks. The generosity and the deduction came from the same hand. The Hearst fortune, built on homestake gold extracted from Lakota treaty land, purchased from 4 men who did not grasp what they were selling, would fund the career of George and Phoebe's only son, William Randolph Hearst, who used it to build the largest newspaper empire in the United States. The chain of custody runs in a straight line, a broken treaty, a canyon of dead trees, a $70,000 transaction, and eventually the front pages of newspapers in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The gold went into the ground as ore and came out as influence. The town went to sleep on Thursday night, September 25th, 1879, with nothing unusual in the air. The weather had been fine. The bakeries on Sherman Street were preparing for the morning trade, and in the Empire Bakery, owned by a woman named Mrs. Elsner, the first loaves of the day were already going into the ovens. The interior walls were pine planks lined with canvas and spattered with grease and flour dust. The light came from coal oil lamps set on wooden tables. At approximately 3:30 in the morning, a baker knocked a lamp to the floor. The oil spread across the planks and caught. The canvas lining went next, then the walls, then the ceiling, and within minutes the fire had moved to the adjoining buildings on Sherman Street. A volunteer hose team arrived with a cart, but the hoses were too short to reach Whitewood Creek, and Deadwood had no water system. No underground mains, no hydrants, no pumps. The volunteers stood in the street holding dry hoses and watched the fire cross to the other side. The Langrish Theater burned. The offices of the Black Hills Pioneer burned. The Overland Hotel burned. The county recorder's office, with whatever scraps of official paperwork had accumulated in 3 years of improvised governance, burned. Then the fire reached Jensen and Bliss Hardware. In the back of the store sat 8 kegs of black gunpowder. The explosion that followed was heard for miles. It blew the building apart and launched flaming planks and debris into the air above the gulch, where the pieces hung for a moment, caught in the updraft, before raining down across rooftops in every direction. Until that point, the fire had been moving building to building, street to street, following the logic of wind and proximity. After the explosion, fire was falling from the sky. Buildings that stood blocks from the bakery were burning from the top down. The sap-filled pine lumber that every structure in Deadwood was built from caught like kindling. The town had been engineered, without anyone meaning to, as fuel. By dawn, 175 structures were gone, along with the 270 businesses they had housed. The damage was later estimated at $1.6 million, though some contemporary reports put it as high as $2 million. Starr and Bullock Hardware, the store Seth Bullock had opened 3 years earlier, lost $25,000 worth of inventory, only $15,000 of it insured. The First National Bank lost $8,000 uninsured. Grocer after grocer, clothier after clothier. The loss reports read like an inventory of everything. Deadwood had managed to build since the first tent went up in the spring of 1876. One person died. His name was John King. Though most people in town knew him as Casino Jack, he was deaf. He was asleep in a room at Stone's Hotel when the fire reached the building, and he did not hear the alarm bells, or the shouting, or the explosion, or the sound of 300 structures collapsing around him. Everyone else in Deadwood heard all of it. Casino Jack heard none of it. He burned in his bed. The Black Hills Daily Times published its account of the disaster on November 4th, more than a month later, once the paper had a building to print in again. The article opened with a flourish that sounds almost cheerful. Today the city Phoenix-like arises from her ashes in more than pristine glory and is a stable monument to the grit and energy of our citizens. But deeper in the text, the tone shifted. The paper reported that in the days following the fire, men who had not tasted liquor for years imbibed freely to drown their sorrow, and the number of intoxicated men seen on the streets was appalling. Fights were of frequent and hourly occurrence, and disorder and discord was beginning to get possession of the town. Many people left. The 1880 census, taken the following summer, counted 3,777 residents, down sharply from estimates that had ranged as high as 10,000 in the peak months of the rush. Those who stayed began rebuilding the next day. Some accounts say they started before the ground had cooled. Temporary structures and tents went up first to get businesses running. Then came the permanent buildings, and this time the material was different: brick, stone, masonry. The new Main Street rose in Victorian facades of red and cream-colored brick, with stone lintels and cornices and cast iron storefronts. One of the first buildings completed was called the Phoenix Block, and the name was not subtle, but it was accurate. The town had burned to the ground and built itself back in a different material, and the buildings that went up in 1879 and 1880 are, in large part, the buildings still standing on Main Street today. The same month as the fire, the Black Hills Water and Canal Company was granted a 20-year franchise to supply water to Deadwood Gulch. Underground mains were installed. Fire hydrants appeared at the corners of Williams and Deadwood streets. The pipes were lined with coal tar and connected with white lead. Deadwood now had water pressure, a hook and ladder company, and a downtown built of materials that would not ignite from a tipped lamp. The town had learned from its destruction, and the lesson had cost $1.6 million and one deaf man's life. 4 years later, the lesson proved incomplete. In May of 1883, a late spring snowstorm blanketed the Black Hills, followed by days of heavy rain. The snowpack on the surrounding slopes melted fast, and the water ran downhill to the only place it could go: Whitewood Creek, which ran through the center of Deadwood. A telephone call from upstream carried a warning that has survived in the historical record for its bluntness. Prepare for the worst. The creek broke its banks and tore through the gulch, carrying buildings off their foundations. Debris piled against the Lee Street Bridge, forming a dam that redirected the current into the streets. Water carved new channels through the town, undermining structures that had survived the fire 4 years earlier. The flood swept away over 100 buildings. It destroyed Chinatown on Lower Main Street, scattering the community that Wong Fei Lee had built. 3 people were killed, and every bridge in Deadwood was gone. The townspeople rebuilt again. This time they constructed a retaining wall along the creek bed, though flooding would continue to plague the gulch for another 80 years, until engineers in the 1960s finally contained Whitewood Creek and built a highway over it, the creek that had once run openly through the center of town. The same creek that the first prospectors had panned for gold in 1876 now flows beneath the road, invisible to tourists walking Main Street above. Deadwood had now been destroyed 3 times in its first 7 years, twice by fire, once by flood. Each time it rebuilt. Each time the new version was more solid than the last. Pine to brick, open creek to retaining wall, canvas-lined walls to plaster and stone. The pattern established something about Deadwood that would hold for the next century and beyond. The town was not resilient in the way that word usually gets used, to describe a place that absorbs damage and carries on. Deadwood was resilient in a stranger sense. It required destruction to improve. Every catastrophe produced a better town than the one that had burned or washed away, as if Deadwood could not bring itself to plan ahead, but was perfectly willing to learn from disaster. Over and over, each lesson written in ash or mud or both. Seth Bullock had arrived in Deadwood 2 days before Wild Bill Hickok was killed, carrying a wagon load of shovels and nails. He stayed for 43 years. In that time, he went from hardware merchant to sheriff of Lawrence County to deputy United States Marshal, to friend and confidant of Theodore Roosevelt, to the man who, more than anyone else, turned Deadwood from a mining camp into something that resembled a town. The appointment as sheriff came in 1877, handed down by the territorial governor after the Fort Laramie Treaty was formally abrogated, and the Black Hills were open to white settlement by act of Congress. Bullock was not a gunfighter. He was a former Montana territorial senator who had helped create Yellowstone National Park, a man more comfortable with paperwork than pistols. His method of law enforcement relied less on violence than on physical presence. He was tall, lean, and possessed of a stare that contemporaries described as sufficient to end most arguments before they started. He did not clean up Deadwood overnight, and he did not try. What he did was establish, for the first time, that someone in the Gulch had the legal standing to say no. The difference between Bullock and the miners' courts that preceded him was not temperament but authority. After the 1877 Act, Lawrence County was formally organized. Deadwood had a mayor, a city charter, and a sheriff whose badge derived from territorial law rather than the consensus of armed strangers. The transition was messy. Bullock lost his first election. Federal authorities overruled the governor's appointment and ordered a vote, which Bullock did not win. He returned to selling hardware. But the infrastructure of law had been planted, and it grew the way infrastructure does in small towns, slowly, unevenly, one ordinance at a time. Through the 1880s, Deadwood thickened into a real community. The 7 mining camps scattered along the Gulch: Montana City, Fountain City, Elizabethtown, Deadwood City, South Deadwood, Ingleside, and Cleveland, consolidated into a single municipality in 1881. Streets were macadamized and fitted with sewers, manholes, and sandstone curbs. In 1883, the Electric Light Company received permission to erect poles and string wire. By December of that year, Deadwood was illuminated by electricity. A horse-drawn trolley system was incorporated in 1888, running a loop through Main, Lee, and Sherman streets. The town was acquiring the things that towns have: routine, services, a sense that tomorrow would look much like today. In 1890, the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley Railroad steamed into Deadwood for the first time, ending the era of oxen trains and stagecoaches. Bullock and his partner Sol Starr had helped persuade the railroad to build through the region by offering land across their ranch at no cost. The railroad connected Deadwood to Omaha and beyond, which meant that goods no longer arrived by wagon from Sidney, Nebraska, and passengers no longer needed 3 days and a strong constitution to reach the Gulch. It also meant that Deadwood's isolation, the geographic fact that had made it both dangerous and free, was over. The town that emerged in the 1890s looked nothing like the camp of 1876. Main Street was lined with Victorian commercial buildings in red and cream brick, decorated with cast-iron storefronts, stone cornices, and arched windows in styles that architects would later classify as Italianate, Queen Anne, Colonial Revival, and Second Empire. Residences climbed the hillsides in tiers, with the more respectable families perched highest above the Gulch, as if altitude conferred moral distance from the badlands below. Bullock and Starr, after their hardware store burned in the fire of 1894, built Deadwood's first hotel on the same lot, a 3-story, 63-room establishment with steam heat, a bathroom on each floor, and a dining room that hosted visiting dignitaries. It cost $40,000 to build. The Bullock Hotel still stands. A Carnegie Library went up in 1904. A courthouse followed in 1905. Seth Bullock, by then a United States Marshal appointed by his friend President Roosevelt, erected a monument to Roosevelt on Sheep Mountain overlooking the town, the first Roosevelt memorial in the country. When Bullock died in 1919, he was buried at Mount Moriah Cemetery with his grave facing the monument, still keeping watch over a president who had once described him as a true Westerner, the finest type of frontiersman. The Victorian buildings, the library, the courthouse, the hotel, all of it was real and solid and meant to last. But beneath the veneer, Deadwood had not stopped being Deadwood. The Badlands District on Lower Main Street continued to operate with something between official tolerance and collective blindness. Saloons occupied the ground floors, brothels the floors above, and the arrangement persisted decade after decade, as if the buildings had been designed for exactly that purpose, which in many cases they had. Al Swearengen's Gem Theater had burned in 1879, been rebuilt, and burned again in 1899, and Swearengen left town for good that year, eventually dying while trying to board a train in Denver. But the industry he had helped establish did not leave with him. From 1876 until 1980, prostitution operated in Deadwood as what everyone acknowledged to be an open secret. No city ordinance was ever passed to outlaw it. The state had laws against it, but enforcement was sporadic and often theatrical. A raid here, a fine there, business as usual by the following week. During Prohibition, Deadwood handled the ban on alcohol with similar creativity. The saloons simply moved behind closed doors, and gambling went with them. A visitor to Deadwood in 1930 could have walked into a building with a Victorian facade, a brass chandelier, and a framed photograph of Theodore Roosevelt on the wall, and found a backroom poker game, a bottle of whiskey, and a woman available for hire on the second floor. The veneer was exactly that, a surface applied over the same structure that had existed since 1876, now dressed in brick instead of pine. This was not hypocrisy in the usual sense. It was something more like an economic arrangement that everyone understood and no one discussed in polite company. The brothels paid informal taxes. They employed women who had few other options. They kept money circulating in a town that had no other major industry after the placer mining ended, and the homestake operation shifted its economic gravity to lead. Deadwood survived the early 20th century not because it had reformed, but because it had learned to dress its oldest businesses in respectable architecture and keep them running behind doors that everyone knew how to find. The population told a quieter story than the buildings did. The 1880 census had counted 3,777 people. By 1890, it was 2,366. A brief spike during the hard rock mining boom of the 1890s pushed numbers up, and by the 1940s, Deadwood counted around 4,000 residents. Then the decline resumed. The mines contracted. The young left for Rapid City, for Sioux Falls, for anywhere with jobs that did not involve standing in a gulch selling nostalgia to tourists. Deadwood's buildings grew more beautiful as its population grew smaller, which is a pattern common to town that are becoming museums of themselves without quite admitting it. The decline did not announce itself. It arrived the way most declines do, as a series of small subtractions that no single year could account for, but that added up, over decades, to a town losing its reason for existing. The Federal Gold Reserve Act of 1934 fixed the price of gold at $35 per ounce, nearly double the previous rate, and for a brief, strange interval, the lead Deadwood area thrived while the rest of the country starved through the Depression. Homestake hired men that other industries had laid off. The stamp mills ran around the clock. Gold, for once, was counter-cyclical. The worse things got elsewhere, the more the government wanted it. Then the war came, and gold mining was classified as a non-essential industry, and the mines were ordered shut. Most of the smaller operations in the Black Hills never reopened. When the war ended, the costs of labor and materials had risen so far that only Homestake, with its deep shafts and industrial scale, could justify continued production. The individual mines that had given Deadwood its purpose were gone. Gambling was officially shut down in 1947, or rather, it was officially acknowledged to be illegal, which it had technically been for years. The card games moved to back rooms and basements. The slot machines disappeared from the bars, or, at least, from the parts of the bars that a visiting state official might see. Deadwood had always understood the difference between what the law said and what the town did, and the shutdown of gambling was administered with the same selective vision that had governed everything since 1876. The brothels, meanwhile, carried on. By the 1960s and 70s, 4 main establishments remained, each identified by the color of its door: the white door, the green door, the beige door, and the purple door. They operated on the upper floors of Main Street buildings, above the souvenir shops and the bars, in the same spatial arrangement that had existed since the 1870s. Commerce below, flesh above. The madames ran their houses with a degree of civic engagement that blurred the line between vice and volunteerism. They bought fire trucks for the town. They sponsored youth programs. They contributed to the Days of '76 celebration, Deadwood's annual rodeo and heritage festival. The relationship between the brothels and the community was not hidden so much as it was understood. A transaction in which silence was exchanged for participation, and everyone pretended that the second floors did not exist. No city ordinance had ever been passed to outlaw prostitution in Deadwood. The state had laws against it, but local enforcement treated the statutes the way Deadwood had always treated inconvenient rules, as suggestions meant for other places. The arrangement held for over a century, surviving Prohibition, 2 world wars, the closure of the mines, and the slow departure of everyone under 30. It ended on May 21st, 1980, when federal agents, state police, and officers from the Division of Criminal Investigation arrived with only 5 minutes' notice to local law enforcement. They raided the remaining brothels and arrested 16 women. None of the madams were present. The charges were not for prostitution. They were for tax evasion and alleged ties to organized crime. One reporter noted that the raid accomplished what Marshal Hickok never would have done, which was a clever line but slightly wrong. Hickok had never been a marshal in Deadwood, and the comparison presumed he would have wanted to shut the brothels down, a notion that nothing in his biography supports. The town responded with a Save Our Tail parade, and the name was exactly the kind of joke Deadwood had always made about itself. Pam Holliday, Madam of the Purple Door, appeared on the Phil Donahue Show and the Tomorrow Show to plead her case, casting herself as a scapegoat of government overreach in a town that had governed its own affairs just fine for 104 years. The publicity changed nothing. The doors were padlocked. A century of continuous operation, stretching from the wagon train that brought the first working women in July of 1876 to the federal agents who carried the last ones out in May of 1980, was over. What remained was a town with no active industry. Homestake still operated in lead, but lead was lead, and its payroll sustained its own merchants and schools and churches. Deadwood had tourism, such as it was. A summer season that ran from Memorial Day to Labor Day, when visitors came to see Mount Moriah Cemetery and stand where Wild Bill had been shot and buy souvenirs with the dead man's hand printed on them. The Sturgis Motorcycle Rally, held every August in a town 30 miles away, sent overflow crowds into Deadwood's bars for a week or two. In winter, nearby ski areas drew a modest trickle. None of it was enough. The population, which had hovered around 4,000 in the 1940s, sank steadily through the 50s and 60s and settled around 1,800 by the 1980s. In 1961, the entire town had been designated a National Historic Landmark by the Department of the Interior, a recognition that Deadwood's collection of late 19th century frontier architecture was essentially intact, because nothing had been built to replace it. The designation was meant as an honor. It was also a diagnosis. Towns that receive landmark status for buildings they cannot afford to maintain are towns that have stopped growing. Deadwood's Victorian facades, the brick and stone monuments to the rebuilding after the fire of 1879, were deteriorating. Paint peeled, mortar crumbled, windows went dark. The buildings that Seth Bullock and Harris Franklin and Sol Starr had raised as proof of permanence were beginning to look like what they were becoming: exhibits. Interstate 90, completed through western South Dakota in 1964, bypassed Deadwood entirely. Travelers who had once driven through the gulch on their way to the Black Hills now sailed past on a 4-lane highway without slowing down. The old road still ran through town, but the traffic that had sustained gas stations and diners and motel rooms was gone. Deadwood was no longer on the way to anywhere. If you had stood on Main Street in the winter of 1987, you would have seen a town that was recognizably the same place it had been in 1900, the same brick facades, the same steep hillsides, the same creek running under the road, but emptied out, the way a house is recognizably the same house after the family moves away. Storefronts were boarded, hotels were closed. The Bullock Hotel, which Seth Bullock had built for $40,000 in 1895, was struggling to fill its rooms. The buildings were there. The people were not. On December 15th of that year, fire broke out in the Syndicate block on Main Street, and 3 buildings burned. The damage was bad, but it was the symbolism that cut deepest. Deadwood had survived the fire of 1879 by rebuilding in brick. Now the brick was burning, and there was no guarantee that anyone would rebuild at all. The town was 70 years past its peak, 20 years into a decline that showed no sign of reversing, and running out of the thing that had saved it every time before: people stubborn enough to stay. The footage of the Syndicate block, burning on December 15, 1987, became the most important piece of film in Deadwood's history. Not because the fire was the worst the town had suffered, but because someone had the presence of mind to point a camera at it and recognize that the images could be used. Flames climbed the brick facade of a building that had stood on Main Street for over a century. The roof collapsed. Sparks drifted over the gulch in the dark. The footage looked like the end of something, which was exactly the point. A local businessman named Bill Trucano and 7 other residents had already been discussing an idea that was either desperate or brilliant, depending on which year you were standing in. They wanted to legalize gambling in Deadwood. The idea was not new. Deadwood had been a gambling town since 1876, and the fact that gambling had been officially illegal since 1947 had not meaningfully interrupted the practice. What was new was the mechanism: a constitutional amendment submitted to the voters of the entire state of South Dakota that would allow limited stakes gaming within the city limits of Deadwood, with a portion of the tax revenue dedicated to historic preservation. The argument was that Deadwood's buildings were falling apart, that preservation cost money the town did not have, and that gambling, the thing Deadwood had always done anyway, could fund the restoration of the architecture that made Deadwood worth preserving. The circularity of the logic was part of its charm. Deadwood would save itself by legalizing what it had never really stopped doing. Trucano and his group called themselves Deadwood, You Bet. They put in 20,000 volunteer hours over 5 years, crisscrossing South Dakota to gather signatures and build support. They showed the Syndicate block footage at community meetings and legislative hearings. They framed the amendment not as a vote for gambling, but as a vote for history, for the Carnegie Library, the Bullock Hotel, the Victorian storefronts, the brick buildings that the fire of 1879 had made possible, and that the slow erosion of the 20th century was now destroying. The pitch worked. In November 1988, 64% of South Dakota voters approved the constitutional amendment. The state legislature passed enabling legislation the following April. Deadwood citizens ratified it in a special town election. At high noon on November 1st, 1989, an actor dressed as Wild Bill Hickok, accompanied by a woman playing Calamity Jane, fired a revolver into the air on Main Street. Legalized gambling had arrived. Deadwood was now the third place in the United States where a person could walk into a licensed establishment and put money on a card game or a slot machine, after Nevada, which had legalized gambling in 1931, and Atlantic City, which had opened its casinos in 1978. The stakes were limited, $5 per bet, a ceiling that would later be raised to $100 and then $1,000, and only slot machines and card games were permitted. No roulette, no craps, no sports betting. The restrictions were designed to keep Deadwood from becoming Las Vegas, though the question of what Deadwood was becoming instead would take years to answer. The transformation was not gradual. It was violent in the way that money is violent when it arrives all at once in a place that has had none for a long time. Streets and sidewalks were ripped up to restore cobblestones and install new water mains. The fire station was renovated. The museum and library received new funding. City Hall and the police department moved into new quarters. A visitors' center opened in the old train depot. Buildings that had been dark for years were suddenly full of contractors and electricians. In 1990, the city's building inspector could walk down Main Street and find construction underway in every other building. Before gambling, the architectural drawings for all of Deadwood's building projects fit in one file drawer per decade. After gambling, they filled one drawer per year, but the construction was not neutral. What went into the renovated buildings was, overwhelmingly, casinos. Marie's Cafe, where residents had gathered for coffee, became a gaming floor. Ole's, where men had played cards for matchsticks and conversation, became a gaming floor with the same cards and different stakes. The Fairmont Hotel, which had been a brothel in boom times and a flophouse during busts, became a casino. Its owner sank $1.6 million of his own money and $300,000 in city preservation loans into the renovation. The number echoed, probably without anyone noticing, the estimated damage from the fire of 1879. Deadwood had a habit of spending exactly what it had lost, as if the town's books always had to balance against their own history. Real estate prices surged. Properties that had been nearly worthless in 1988 were suddenly selling for multiples that no one in the Gulch had imagined. Kevin Costner, fresh from filming Dances with Wolves in South Dakota, bought a casino in the Phoenix Block, the same building that had been named for the mythical bird when it was rebuilt after the 1879 fire. He called it the Midnight Star. The symmetry was too neat to be accidental and too commercial to be sentimental. Within 2 decades, gamblers had wagered more than $12.7 billion in Deadwood's casinos. They won back nearly $11.6 billion, leaving over $1.1 billion in gross revenue for the casino operators. The casinos paid $208 million in taxes, of which more than $123 million went directly to the city for infrastructure and preservation. The Victorian buildings that had been crumbling in 1987 were restored to a condition that the men who built them in 1880 would not have recognized. Cleaner, brighter, better maintained than they had ever been. Their facades scrubbed and repointed, their interiors gutted and rebuilt around slot machines that chimed and flashed, in rooms where miners had once weighed gold dust on pocket scales. The people who had lived at Deadwood before gambling arrived were not uniformly grateful. Some found themselves priced out of their own town. Others watched businesses they had frequented for decades convert overnight into gaming halls, where they were no longer the customers that mattered. Before legalization, people in Deadwood had looked after each other at the card tables. A bar owner might return money to a customer who lost too much. After legalization, the games were regulated by the state, and the old courtesies were replaced by compliance. One longtime resident put it plainly, "I'd rather deal with the mafia than get picked to death by bureaucrats." Deadwood had been the only legal gambling destination in its region for a brief window, but the monopoly did not last. 3 mining towns in Colorado legalized gaming shortly after. Indian reservations across the Great Plains opened casinos of their own. Video lottery machines appeared in nearly every bar and pizza parlor in South Dakota. The competitive pressure squeezed Deadwood's smaller operators, some of whom had bought in at inflated prices and now found it nearly impossible to sell. The boom leveled off into something more ambiguous. Not a bust, but not the unlimited future that the You Bet Committee had promised either. What gambling did accomplish, beyond the revenue and the restoration, was to complete a transformation that had been underway since the first tourist bought a postcard of Wild Bill's grave. Deadwood was now, fully and without pretense, in the business of selling its own past. The lawlessness that had defined the town in 1876. The murders, the gambling, the brothels, the absence of any authority, had become the product. Visitors came to Deadwood to stand in a reconstructed saloon and watch an actor get shot in the back of the head at 4:15 in the afternoon 6 days a week, all summer long. They came to play cards in a room with a Victorian chandelier and a historical marker on the wall. They came to buy a T-shirt with a dead man's hand printed on it and drive home on the interstate that had bypassed the town a quarter century earlier. Deadwood had survived by turning itself into a performance of Deadwood, and the performance was funded by the same activity, gambling, that had operated in the Gulch since the day the first tent went up. At 7:46, on the evening of December 14th, 2001, Homestake Mining Company extracted its last ton of gold ore from the 1,400-foot level of the mine in Lead, South Dakota. The spot was almost directly beneath the open cut, the surface excavation, where Fred and Moses Manuel had found their outcropping 125 years earlier. On the same day, the Homestake Mining Company was removed from the New York Stock Exchange, where it had been listed since January 25, 1879. The first mining stock ever traded on that exchange, and one of the longest continuously listed securities in its history. Barrick Gold of Toronto absorbed what remained. The pumps and ventilation systems that had kept the mine habitable cost $250,000 a month to run. In June of 2003, the company switched them off, and water began to rise in the shafts. Over its lifetime, the Homestake mine produced just under 40 million troy ounces of gold and 9 million ounces of silver from 370 miles of tunnels, shafts, and chambers reaching 8,000 feet below the surface of the earth. The ore had averaged less than 1/3 of an ounce of gold per ton, low grade by any standard, but the body of ore was enormous, and the operation never stopped. At the price gold trades for today, roughly $4,000 per ounce, the mine's total output would be worth approximately $160 billion. George Hearst paid $70,000 for the claim. The mine did not stay dead. In the 1960s, while Homestake was still operating, a nuclear chemist from Brookhaven National Laboratory named Raymond Davis, Jr., had built a solar neutrino detector in a cavern at the 4,850-foot level. The experiment involved a 100,000-gallon tank of perchloroethylene, dry cleaning fluid, placed nearly a mile underground, where the rock above filtered out cosmic radiation and allowed only neutrinos to pass through. Davis discovered that the sun was producing far fewer neutrinos than physicists had predicted, a finding that became known as the solar neutrino problem and upended decades of assumptions about how stars burn. In 2002, the same year the mine closed, Davis received the Nobel Prize in Physics. In 2006, Barrick Gold donated the Homestake property to the state of South Dakota. A philanthropist named T. Denny Sanford contributed $70 million. The state legislature created the South Dakota Science and Technology Authority to manage what became the Sanford Underground Research Facility. Today, physicists from dozens of countries work nearly a mile below the town of Lead, operating some of the most sensitive instruments on Earth, searching for dark matter, studying the properties of neutrinos, probing questions about the origins of the universe that would have meant nothing to the men who dug the tunnels they now occupy. The shafts that George Hurst carved to extract gold from Lakota land are now used to listen for particles that pass through the entire planet without touching anything. 2 years after the mine closed, HBO premiered a television series called Deadwood. The show drew the largest audience for a new series in the network's history. It ran for 3 seasons and depicted the town's early days with a fidelity to profanity and violence that no tourism board would have approved. The series brought a new generation of visitors to Main Street, where they could stand outside the reconstructed Saloon Number 10, walk up to Mount Moriah Cemetery, and take a photograph next to the graves of Hickok and Calamity Jane, still lying side by side, just as Jane had insisted, whether Hickok would have wanted it or not. The 2020 census counted 1,156 people living in Deadwood. The number is smaller than the population of the town in any year since it was founded, including the years when it was supposedly dying. The casinos still run. The slot machines still chime. The trial of Jack McCall is still performed in the summer, as it has been since 1924, making it one of the longest-running stage plays in the country. Tourists still come, though not in the numbers that the You Bet Committee once projected. The Victorian buildings on Main Street, restored with gambling revenue, remain in better condition than at any point since they were built. Deadwood looks the way it looked in 1895, except that the people who built it are gone, and the people who visit it are passing through. And somewhere in the Federal Ledger, the exact amount now shielded from public disclosure at the request of the Oglala Sioux tribe sits an account that has been accruing compound interest since 1980. The original sum was $105 million, awarded by the United States Supreme Court as compensation for the taking of the Black Hills. The court's own language was blunt. Justice Harry Blackmun wrote that a more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealings will never, in all probability, be found in our history. The award acknowledged what had been true since 1877, that the seizure of the Black Hills violated the Fort Laramie Treaty, that the required consent of 3/4 of adult male Sioux was never obtained, and that the United States had taken the land by force and kept it. The Lakota have never accepted the money. The account has grown past $1 billion. Acceptance would constitute a sale, and the position of every Sioux nation that has weighed in on the matter is the same one it was in 1877. The land was never for sale. The Pine Ridge Reservation, home of the Oglala Sioux, sits less than 100 miles southeast of Deadwood. Male life expectancy there averages around 48 years. Unemployment runs above 80%. Half the children live in poverty. $1 billion sits in a government trust account, uncollected, because collecting it would mean the transaction was complete. Deadwood Gulch is quiet in the off-season. The creek that gave the town its name still runs beneath the highway, enclosed in concrete since the 1960s, invisible to anyone walking above. The dead trees that lined the canyon walls in 1876 are long gone, cut for lumber, burned in fires, or simply rotted away. The hills above the gulch are covered in living ponderosa now, thick and dark enough to look black from a distance, the way they looked to the Lakota before the treaty was signed, before Custer rode in with 1,200 men and a brass band, before the first miner drove a stake into the creek bed and called it his. The gold is gone. The trees grew back. The creek still runs under the road in the dark, the way it always did.